Thank Maxine Levin, National Leader for Interpretations, for being here to support our webinar and introduce our presenter. Maxine, I'm going to turn the webinar over to you so you can introduce the topic and our presenter.
Okay. So my name is Maxine Levin. I'm the National Leader for Interpretations with the Natural Resources Conservation Service Soil Science Division at the National Soil Survey Center. And Susan Southard has been working for many years. I'd say, Sue, is it almost 10 years? I think it is.
Yeah, since 2007.
Since 2007, she's been the liaison for the soil survey to the National Park Service. And during this period of time, she's worked on many parks, facilitating the National Park Service to work with the National Natural Resources Conservation Service to create soil surveys for the national parks. And within this context of working with the national parks, she's gotten really excited about the way that soils can really accentuate and improve the experience for the national park goer and participant, and that's about what she's going to be talking about with this session. And so I think I'll leave it at that, and then also she will also introduce the fact that this is the National Park Service's centennial, the 100th anniversary of the national parks coming into existence, and in honor of that, we wanted to have this webinar. So go ahead, Sue.
I just want to say I'm honored to present this webinar today, and I hope that we all learned something from this. My topic, Celebrating Soils of Our National Park Lands, I hope to focus on just a few select parks. I chose these parks because of the stories that they tell and because of their geographic and soil diversity, but also because they represent good examples of interesting soil interpretations that could be made for all of the 270 parks within the National Park Service Soil Resource Inventory, which is their program, as many of you are familiar, to map all the national parks in the country that that have some land to them. So for the next slide. When I say soil interpretations here, though, I want to say most of you are probably thinking of interpretations pertaining to engineering, recreational, or urban uses of soils. But here, I want interpretation to mean translating nature for the typical park visitor in hopes of increasing visitor knowledge about soils and soils' relationship to our history and as well to our natural environment. I would like to offer that the translation of nature should include a focus on soils and not only their role in park ecosystems, but also the influences they've had on human history and culture. Integrating soil science into the national park visitor experience is one way that we can increase natural science literacy and further the recognition of our discipline of soil science. Next slide. This is what I hear from people trying to use our data. They say, and specifically in the National Park Service, they say, I don't know the words to use, or soil seems so complicated, or I hear some other variation of these thoughts and words. I feel we provide soil data in the extremes as either technical papers, tables, and maps, or intricate and complicated databases that few can use or understand, and we try to promote awareness with dancing Disney-esque characters and worm cartoons that do not really offer information that's easily consumed by audiences of all ages. Nor do we provide information at a level that encourages science literacy. By translating what we know about soils in a way that people can relate without dumbing down the subject, we can build interest in pedology and develop credibility as a science and help explain at the same time the park landscapes that we see. Digging a little bit deeper into American history often reveals interesting links and facts about the role soils have played in influencing historical outcomes and experiences people have had. Most National Park Service properties have soil maps, as many of you know, that were completed as part of the National Cooperative Soil Survey, of which the NRCS plays the lead role. The MPS is one of our major federal contributors to the National Cooperative Soil Survey, and through its soil resource inventory program has acquired, through interagency agreements, soil mapping on national park managed lands. It's important here, though, that we should realize that park staffs are without trained soil scientists. They need assistance with interpretation on the soil survey end products. Interpretation also often reveals soil stories linking soil science and history. This talk will illustrate the role soils have had in the lives of people over centuries. In celebrating the National Park Service centennial, we will focus only on stories within park boundaries. So let's begin our journey in northern Arizona, a desert region with variable precipitation, many different kinds of rock formations, sporadic volcanic activity, and wide open spaces. We will focus on two park properties here, Sunset Crater and Wupatki National Monuments, and look at the events that happened here approximately 900 years ago, or in 1100 CE, or in Common Era. Both parks are located north of Flagstaff, and Sunset Crater National Monument is located south of Wupatki. In the slide here, Sunset Crater is a small green area in the lower left-hand corner of the map on the right. In the lower I don't know how to point with this thing. Let's see. Well, anyway, you can see the small little green square on the map. And then it's on the lower left-hand corner on the map on the right. And then Wupatki is the larger green area in the upper right of the park map. First, a brief description of Sunset Crater National Monument. Sunset Crater volcano is a small part of the San Francisco volcanic field. Like many volcanic fields, the San Francisco volcanic field sits over a hot spot in the mantle. The principal events that shape the land within Sunset Crater Volcano National Monument are cinder cone eruptions and lava flows. Recent volcanic eruptions at Sunset Crater are thought to have begun in 1064 Common Era. Eruptions continued to about 1200 Common Era, covering much of the park with cinders to depths ranging from 10 to 40 feet. Sunset Crater is a cinder cone itself, and it rose to 1,000 feet during this time. Tephra covered large areas of Wupatki National Monument, which I pointed out on the slide here, which is the green area there. And so here I would like to show a soil map of some of Sunset Crater. And it covered, this is Sunset Crater, and then Wupatki is to the north. Tephra covered large areas of Wupatki National Monument, 16 miles to the north. This general soils map diagram shows some of the soil and landscape relationships that were mapped by the park by Flagstaff NRCS soil scientists. These images now are from Wupatki National Monument. Sunset Crater to the south of Wupatki, pointed out in the previous slide, erupted roughly 900 years ago and draped the red Moenkopi sandstone of Wupatki National Monument with a surface of black cinders with variable thicknesses. These cinders have been heavily reworked by the wind. After the eruptions, the pre-Hopi, or what is referred to as the Sinagua, which means without water, the Sinagua culture thrived and built some of the largest dwellings observed of their entire culture, as you can see on the right side of the slide. The pottery inset here was discovered in reworked cinders. Some discoveries of these jugs have been where they were placed to receive runoff from exposed bedrock. This area is very dry and receives about 8 inches of rain a year. Soil scientists mapping the park observed varying thickness of black Sunset Crater ash over the soils of Wupatki. Ecological sites were developed for the park during the mapping that address the effects of the cinders on vegetation diversity and productivity. The Moenkopi sandstone is mostly mapped with vitrandic subgroups of durids, cambids, and orthents. Here you can see a profile on the right of a typical soil profile in Wupatki with the overburden of black cinders from Sunset Crater. It is believed that superficial ash and cinder layers may act as a water retaining and temperature moderating mulch. Mulching increases water infiltration and retention due to pore size. Color influences albedo and therefore soil temperature and increases the moisture retention through condensation. The surface has reduced turbulent airflow, thus reducing wind erosion and soil desiccation. There is decreased salinization also to the soils due to the reduced evaporative processes. These advantages of the mulch may have allowed for greater productivity in the soils. In Wupatki, the Donik cliffs separate the Triassic Moenkopi sandstone formation of the Wupatki Basin, here on the right, with the Permian-age Kaibab limestone of the Antelope Prairie to the left. Most building ruins lie along the break of the two formations at Donik Cliffs. Soils of the Kaibab limestone area are mostly austic calciargids or calcic petrocalcids or vitrandic haplocambids. Soils are typic aeritic in the Wupatki Basin on the right due to the rain shadow effect of the San Francisco peaks, and the austic aeritic Antelope Prairie lies to the left where more precipitation falls. It was interesting to see that the highest concentration of cultural resources in the shape of fieldhouse ruins were in the limestone areas where soil scientists mapped argillic horizons. Field houses were small, one-room masonry structures located near fields where farmers lived while tending their fields. Dating of field houses placed them to after the eruption of Sunset Crater. So essentially, the Wupatki were farming the argillics where water holding capacity was higher. So I'll go to the next slide. Around 1250 Common Era, the Wupatki settlements were abandoned. Tree rings and archaeological evidence suggest an increasingly dry, semi-arid climate, reducing soil water availability. The theory here is that the physical and chemical soil properties of cinder-mulched soils most likely aided the Sinagua people to farm lands that were formerly not arable prior to the Sunset Crater eruptions. From this, we can learn and see that soils change quickly, as illustrated by the tephra deposition, or slowly over time, and are affected by climate change. I'd like to note here the San Francisco peaks that you can see in the background are part of an andesitic stratovolcano complex that last erupted 400,000 years ago. This volcanic landscape has no surface streams nor rivers, lending complexity to the Sinagua existence in this area. I decided to add to this presentation some geographic diversity, so I wanted to go to 1100 Common Era in Ocmulgee National Monument of Georgia. At the same time the Sinagua culture existed in the desert to the southwest, the Mississippi mound builders were thriving along the riverbanks in Georgia, as well as along the Mississippi, Ohio, and Missouri rivers and their tributaries. Ocmulgee National Monument is located just outside Macon, Georgia, in south-central Georgia, and is on the fall line between the coastal plain and Piedmont provinces. Evidence such as spears and points show that the area was inhabited for 17,000 years by earlier cultures. Descendants of these Macon Plateau mound builders are the Muskogee, or the Creek tribes of today. When Europeans first arrived in North America, peoples of the Mississippian culture were still using and building these platform mounds. The mound builders were farmers, and their towns were located along the river, specifically where periodic flooding would enrich the soils. They grew corn, beans, squash, and sunflowers, and also gathered fruits and nuts. I'll just mention here in the slide, you see a mound. This is a mound of Ocmulgee on the right, and on the left is a depiction of what the villages might have looked like, where they actually, the mounds were flat on the top to allow housing structures up on top. This is a smaller ceremonial mound at Ocmulgee, and to the upper right you can see the original clay compacted floor. The roof over the earth lodge has been reconstructed. The compacted clay layers reinforce the structure's strength. The soils here are kaolinitic, candiudalts, and canhapudalts, the Orangeburg and Vaucluse soil series. The low-activity kaolinitic clays compacted well and do not shrink and swell. The clay accumulation layers in these soils was also good for pottery. It is interesting to note that the later European settlements were initially also clustered along the fall line where the rivers were deep enough for transportation. The mounds and earth lodges were used for building platforms, burial sites, and religious and social gatherings. Evidence in the mound shows local soils were quarried, then transported in baskets. The mound builders were quite knowledgeable about soil strength and engineering properties. Sometimes the surface of the mounds would get a thick coat of brightly colored red clay. You would assume it would be from some of the ultrasols around the area. These clays were also incorporated into layers of different kinds of clay, soil, and sod using an elaborate engineering technique to inhibit slumping of the mounds and to ensure that their steep slides did not collapse. And I actually recently was at Ocmulgee, and these sides are very, very steep. They're very, very steep, so it is quite amazing that they've held up this long. The large amount of fill needed for the mounds left large holes in the landscape or borrow pits, and these pits were sometimes left to fill with water, and then they stocked them with fish. The mound builders and other regional tribes ate a lot of fresh water and marine shellfish, and their shell middens became buried by soil-forming processes such as alluvial and aeolian deposition. These middens were harvested years later by European settlers who used the shell midden deposits in the soil for their own construction materials. Midden deposits were burned to create lime, then mixed with water, sand, ash, and more oyster shells. This is called tabby construction. The image on the right is of Fort Frederica National Historic Site on St. Simon's Island in Georgia. It was built by James Oglethorpe in 1733 using tabby construction. A close-up of the tabby construction is on the left. Oglethorpe was the founder and first governor of Georgia, and I should add that his most valuable ally in fighting the Spanish influence in the area was Kusapana Kisa, also known as Mary Musgrove, who married a European trader. She was Creek and a descendant of the Macon mound builders who were now responsible for these handy middens. So essentially here we have what another culture's garbage that they threw in the soil became the next culture's building materials for their forts and houses. Now let's advance forward to the 1700s in Fort Necessity National Battlefield in Pennsylvania. In 1754, during an early part of the French and Indian War, George Washington was a newly commissioned 20-something, I think he was 23 or 24, lieutenant colonel under the British governor Robert Dinwiddie of Virginia. Washington built a fort here in the Great Meadow of southwestern PA. He described the location as a charming field for encounter with his earthen ramparts in an open field. Here's a soil web view, you can see, of the reconstructed Palisade Fort area, marked with the red star in the center. Fort Necessity was located in an area of pH, or a phylo loam, 0 to 2% slopes, and has a minor inclusion of Atkins soils in the depressions. Atkins soils are hydric, having saturation near the surface during the growing season. This pH soil map became inundated during summer thunderstorms, and the water table that was near or at the soil surface where the ramparts were excavated and his ammunition stored. The block diagram shows the relative landscape position of soils near Washington's log fort, again marked by the red star. On July 3, 1754, Louis Coulon de Villiers, a French army captain, quickly surrounded Washington's Great Meadow Fort to avenge the Battle of Jumonville Glen, where Washington's troops had earlier killed the French captain's brother. Heavy raid aided the French as Washington's fort became inundated and ammunition became wet and useless. There was no place to divert the water from the Atkins hydric soil area that I showed you in the previous slide, given its depressional landscape position. Washington was surrounded by French troops located on high ground adjacent to him. This was the very first battle of the French and Indian War, and it ended with George Washington's one and only surrender of his entire military career. After this defeat, Washington learned to pay attention to landscape position and soil drainage, and he always took the high ground after that, while later commanding the American troops against the British. His bad experience at Fort Necessity led to a beta version of the Army Corps of Engineers that were used then on to scout sites before setting up a fort. Here you can see his high perches with ramparts made of soil at two famous battlegrounds and now historic parks during the War of Independence, those being Valley Forge National Historic Park in Pennsylvania and Morristown in New Jersey. Now let's skip to the 1800s and the California Gold Rush. This is Fort Baker at the northern base of the Golden Gate Bridge. To give us perspective, Fort Baker is at the base of the right bridge tower in the inset photo to the right, the upper right. Soil scientists familiar with Pacific Coast tectonics and soils would immediately recognize this as an anthropogenic landscape with anthropogenic soils. There are no flat, non-marshy landscapes like this naturally along the California coast of Golden Gate. The uplifted Coast Range of mountains dip steeply straight into the ocean. Low elevation areas along the coast are drowned river valleys associated with post-glacial sea level rise. The soils are marshy wetland estuaries or are eroding hill slopes plunging to the sea. Golden Gate and San Francisco Bay have needed a lot of manipulation for decades in order to be used as a seaport. San Francisco would not have been considered a good natural seaport. Let me give you examples of why in the next two slides. Let me read this 1850s reference to the Golden Gate area I found. The San Francisco area is, and I quote, "a Venice built of pine instead of marble. It's a city of ships and piers and tides. Large ships with railings a good distance from the shore served as residences, stores, and restaurants. I saw places where the tide had flowed down the street, turning the interior of houses into lakes. The whole central part of the city swayed noticeably because it was built on piles the size of ship masts driven down into the mud." Unquote. Part of the swaying was due, in fact, to the low soil strength of the subaqueous and tidal marsh soils that they have built upon. I'll continue to read while you look at these old and somewhat blurry images of gold rush days in San Francisco. And I quote, "Every day more ships arrived, workers landed cargoes, and thousands of men crowded the sandy street seeking passage up the bay and its tributaries to the heart of the gold country. Crowded beyond its capacity, San Francisco was boxed in on all sides by massive shifting sand dunes and a shallow cove that was either a stagnant pond or a sea of thick, foul mud at low tides." Unquote. At the time of the California Gold Rush, these boats were abandoned as the captains could not maintain the crews. Boats were used for building materials or were buried with mud dredgings. Now let's skip from 1849 to the recent times. Level areas in San Francisco are fill. The fill has been mapped as unstable fill, or Zer Arents. It's a mix of dredged up high organic matter, silty marsh soils, old boats, and construction debris. The anthropogenic soils are known for subsidence and liquefaction during earthquakes, such as illustrated here in the image after the Loma Prieta earthquake. This house was in an area of fill. And the inset to the lower left is a recent excavation of a ship's bow buried in the San Francisco Bay fill. At this point, I want to just go fast forward a little bit, 7 years to the end of the gold rush, and now we're in the tallgrass prairie of the Midwest. The Homestead Act is celebrated at Homestead National Monument of America, northwest of Beatrice, Nebraska. In the upper left, you can see the plow-shaped visitor center. The Homestead Act allowed any qualified person to claim up to 160 acres of federally owned land in exchange for 5 years of residence and the cultivation and improvement of the property. The act eventually transferred 270 million acres from public to private ownership. To restore the tallgrass prairie of Homestead that you see here, viable seeds were successfully extracted from a very heavily compacted soil around an old schoolyard within the park. The seeds remained viable where the soil was compacted. For reference of where we are, this map is southeast of Lincoln, Nebraska, and the plow-shaped visitors center that I showed in the previous slide is in the center of the soil web image. The red X marks a map unit of Kennebec silt loam, which you can see by the inset map of series extent is quite a common soil in the tallgrass prairie region of Nebraska and Kansas. On the left side of the image, we can see that the soil organic matter is greater than 5% to over a meter depth in the Kennebec soil. Many homesteaders in the tallgrass prairie built their initial dwellings from sod cut from the native tallgrass prairie. The dense soil, the dense grass roots, which incorporated and sequestered organic carbon at depths in the soil, held the sod bricks together as homesteaders cut them from the native prairie. Based on NRCS certified soil data, Kennebec soil has 55 to 65 kilograms of soil organic carbon computed on a whole soil basis to 2 meters. Based on the chart to the right, you can see that this is a very high level of soil organic carbon as compared to other mollisols that are mapped within the National Park Service Soil Resource Inventory. Using a conversion of 4.45 to change kilograms per meter squared to tons per acre, the Kennebec soil in a pure map unit of Kennebec sequesters 265 tons of carbon per acre. Assuming a total of 6,000 board feet in a 2,000 square foot modern house today, and assuming 1 pound of carbon in every board foot of lumber, the typical wood framing of a modern house contains 6,000 pounds or 3 tons of carbon. Thus, by dividing the 265 tons of carbon per acre of Kennebec soil by the 3 tons of carbon in a modern house, we can say 1 acre of pure Kennebec soil at home has a carbon content equivalent to that of 88 single-family homes in the United States. That's quite a bit of carbon. Now we'll jump almost 100 years to World War II. The Manzanar War Relocation Center in the Owens Valley of California is now a National Historic Site, and it's the best preserved of 10 internment camps that were collectively housing 120,000 internees in the years after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. The majority of the Manzanar internees were American citizens from Southern California in the Los Angeles area. More than 10,000 people of Japanese heritage lived at Manzanar between 1942 and 1945. They were mostly urban business owners or truck farmers who had to sell, rent, or abandon all their property before being escorted under military guard to these camps. What's interesting to note is that a human-induced source of LUS, or PM10, in the vicinity of Manzanar in the Owens Valley is the exposed alkaline lake bed of Owens Lake to the south, which was started to be drained in 1913 by what is referred to as the Owens River diversions. The diversions were owned by Los Angeles Water and Power, who owned the water rights in the entire Owens Valley. As a consequence of drainage and diversions, salt-rich LUS flowed both north and south on winds funneled through the valley. The alkaline LUS, or PM10, is composed of a variety of minerals, so sodium chloride, sodium sulfate, sodium bicarbonate, and sodium carbonate. With the 13,000-foot high Sierra Nevada mountains to the west and the 13,000-foot high Inyo Mountains to the east, winter winds were extremely funneled through the narrow valley northwards towards Manzanar. In addition to this PM10 that was being carried northward, the soil survey of the Owens Valley identifies most of the soil surrounding Manzanar as having high wind erodibility due to loamy sand surfaces. The soils have weathered from granite from the Sierra Nevada range to the west. Manzanar sits on the distal end of Sierra Nevada alluvial fans. At a side note, just right here, I just want to point out, I'd like to mention you can see the dark area to the left of the little red X in the center of the slide. And that's a fault line running north and south. And I'll go back to this reference to the fault line in a couple slides. In the soil survey data, the soils were assigned a wind erodibility group of 2, which is the second highest group. Locally, wind-blown sand was due to the internment camp construction projects. As fresh lumber was used to construct the hastily built barracks, as that fresh lumber dried, gaps in walls and floorboards let more and more penetrating wind-blown sand and Owens Lake PM10 consume the crowded interior living spaces and sleeping quarters. Here are some actual internee words captured in the biography, Farewell to Manzanar. We woke shivering and coated with dust that had blown up through the knotholes. Our cubicle looked as if a great laundry bag had exploded and then sprayed with fine dust. His eyes were gray, and he was looking at me, and my eyes were gray, and my coated hair. Hey, did you guys fall in the same flour barrel as us? Icy gusts of winds were buffeting our barracks every few minutes, sending fresh puffs of dust up through the floorboards. Whoops, there we go. In order to sustain the camps, the United States War Department brokered a deal with the LA Water and Power to divert some water from its water diversions to Manzanar for irrigation and household uses. Here is a picture taken by Ansel Adams of a seemingly very happy, grinning internee with some of his harvest. Ansel Adams was hired by the War Department to take pictures of life in Manzanar. These pictures are archived in the Library of Congress. In addition to working the deep soils that proved to be great agricultural soils when irrigated, the internees built a series of 6 Japanese meditation gardens that offered them refuge from the harsh realities of living behind barbed wire and fences, the remnants which can be seen on the right side of the screen. If you remember the fault line I showed you in the last slide, according to the Manzanar Park superintendent, records show that the internees harvested the organic rich histosols along that fault line seep to amend the sandy granitic soils used for their gardens. According to the Library of Congress, Ansel Adams was not permitted by the War Department to photograph the guard towers that surrounded Manzanar, so no Ansel Adams images exist of the original guard towers. When I compiled the data on Manzanar for the Park Soil Survey report, I decided to include a picture of the reconstructed guard tower on the cover. Manzanar continues, though, however, to have struggles today. This image, I know it's kind of dark and maybe, I don't know how well you can all see it, but it shows a system of water diversions in blue that still exist and that have altered the hydrology of the soils in Manzanar National Historic Site. The park boundary is in green and a visitor road tour is in orange. Existing water law stipulates that if LA Water and Power does not use all the water in the diversions, they will lose the rights to the water. Releasing water from the diversions, especially during periods of extra heavy spring runoff, according to the letter of the law, uses it. Consequently, during periods of high mountain runoff, Manzanar National Historic Site has been flooded by purposely released water releases by the LA Water and Power from these blue diversions that you see on the alluvial fans above the park's cultural resources. These modern-day emergency water releases from LA Water and Power have resulted in breached and eroded meditation gardens built on and from the highly erodible soils derived from granite. Here is an image I took of the breached hospital meditation garden at Manzanar. As well, other cultural resources such as the historic rock-lined root cellars have been buried by sediment caused by these water diversions. So, in summary, we've visited 7 of the 270 park properties in the soil resource inventory, and I wanted to just take a minute to review some of the information that we learned. We saw that in Wupatki and Sunset Crater National Monument in Arizona, that the people knew their soils. They were farming the argillic. There was cinder mulching going on with the albedo effect and pore space, increased pore space and condensation with thermal protection that affected the plant growth. We saw how climate change affected not only the soils but the people that were living there because they became too dry to farm, so people left. They used soils for their pottery, for water collection. Volcanism and soil formation, uplifting and exposure of different geologic formations results in different soils in short distances. We saw that with the Kaibab versus the Moenkopi sandstones. Right next to each other, we have totally different soils. In Ocmulgee, Georgia, native tribes understood their soils. Farming methods such as knowing where the limits of flooding were to enrich their soils, and they also had specific construction practices to maintain soil strength. They used soils for farming and shelter and ceremonial purposes and pottery. What was someone else's trash, their middens, became part of the soils and someone else's treasure, and that would have been Oglethorpe's tabby construction during 1700s. Fort Necessity in Pennsylvania, we saw that the deposition of aluminum and landscape position and wetness and hydrologic process are very important, and that you have to understand where you are on the landscape in terms of planning what you're going to be doing, and that the need for a scoping out beforehand needs to be considered. In Golden Gate, with its coastal faulting and post-glacial submergence, resulted in a lack of deep ports, and the lagoonal sediments and shallow water required the use of fill for creation of made land. Present-day earthquake subsidence and liquefaction consequences due to low soil strength are occurring constantly in that area. We saw in Homestead, the homesteaders were plowing, and which eventually did lead to the Dust Bowl days. But they also used soils for shelter, and we saw that the soil compaction preserved the seeds that were used in trying to bring back the tallgrass prairie. We saw translocation of carbon at depth by roots, resulting in carbon sequestration. And in Manzanar, we saw the PM10 generation from the draining of the Owens Lake with soil carbonates and salts in the arid climate. We saw harvesting of soils along the fault line to increase the fertility of the low fertility sandy soils. And we saw the artificial water application and erosion in artificial water application causing erosion. We saw that existing laws governing natural resources do not always take into consideration harm to the environment and to cultural resources. And the erosion of coarse soils formed from granite are a continual problem. We see that in California a lot. But anyway, so with that, I guess if there are any questions, and I'll leave it to Sean.
All right, and I'll just remind people that the best way to ask a question is to put it in the Q&A pod, and we'll take those questions. So I'll give you a moment to compose your thoughts and enter a question for Sue. Sue, I was thinking when you were talking about how much carbon was in the Kennebec soil in Nebraska and how many homes that would make, I kind of chuckled and I thought, is that furnished or unfurnished homes?
Definitely unfinished.
So we have a comment, a nice presentation.
Yeah, there was one thing I was gonna mention about the burning of the middens. Apparently they would, collect from the different areas where the middens are located in Georgia and burn them, and that would drive off carbon dioxide, which would then create a calcium oxide, and then that calcium oxide becomes the lime that's used for construction materials, just like we do with concrete. So anyway, if anyone has any interest.
So we got some questions coming in. Could you explain what is meant by PM10 soil?
Okay. In the West, we have quite a few areas that, because they're arid, there's quite a bit of what we call particulate matter, which is the PM, and the 10 is for 10 microns or less. So the EPA regulates a lot of areas in the western states on their PM10 generation. And so basically it's anything that can be carried up either from a farmer's plow or from the soil crust. If there's crusting that gets disturbed or whatever, it then allows the less than 10 micron particles to be incorporated into the air and carried quite far distances. There's some disagreement on whether or not the regulation should actually be for PM10 or for PM 3.5 or less, since most of the respirable particulate matter would be smaller than 10 microns. But it's just particulate matter less than 10 microns, and we have a lot of soils that meet that requirement because of the amounts of silts and clay in them in the arid West.
Yeah, really fine dust. Here's somebody that picked up on something that I was thinking about when you're talking about the California coast. Are there any issues with acid sulfate soils in the San Francisco Bay fill?
I know that there are large areas that do have acid sulfate conditions in the San Francisco Bay Area. Most of them that I'm familiar with, they are left as refuge areas. But I've also seen areas where they're actually used for salt evaporative ponds for production of salt, and they become very acid. And so, yes, there are a lot of leftover areas of acid sulfate soils that have been drained, but I think most of them that have been used for fill maybe less so because they're buried so deeply. So that would be my, but I can't imagine that you wouldn't still have, issues somewhere. So.
Okay. Another question, is there an actual push or initiative from the National Park Service to get more awareness or research of these types of soil stories within the parks?
Not that I'm aware of. As far as I know, I think I'm it. But, if all the parks have very interesting sort of stories out there. There were a lot more I could have talked about. I've been particularly interested in some of them in Pennsylvania, specifically the Johnstown flood area and the construction of the dam that collapsed under floodwaters and stuff and killed a lot of people. But there's lots of stories, but I don't know of any initiative within the Park Service to collect these kinds of stories. But I do think it's a good way that we could, if you are working with parks, to go beyond just the databases and stuff that we hand over to them, because I think most of them find them pretty overwhelming, but they really like to glob on to these interesting stories that they can use for park visitors, which for us I think would be very important, because then, as I said in my beginning slides, that it promotes soil science as a discipline to a lot of park visitors, and there's millions and millions and millions of them out there that never really go to a park and think about the soils. The last slide here I had pictures of some of the parks that had been mapped by NRCS. That last slide, the thank you slide. So anyway, any other questions?
Well, Sue, that's exhausted all the questions we had. I want to thank you for your time and effort to make this presentation today, and thanks to all the participants for joining in. We had more than 60 people join today's webinar. The on-demand recording of this webinar will be available on our National Soil Survey Center YouTube channel within a couple of days. Please feel free to let your colleagues know about this training opportunity. This concludes our webinar presentation.